Dr. Russell Dykstra has had a long interest in the Holland area Big Read program. And last year, he coordinated Phil Harrington's HASS presentation on Julia Alvarez's book, In the Time of the Butterflies. Some of you perhaps have read that book and were part of that Big Read. In the 1970s, Dr. Dykstra spent 6 weeks in Admiral Hyman G. Rickover's nuclear U.S. Navy, learning and then teaching nuclear propulsion engineering. After witnessing a missile launch at sea in April 1977, he had a mystical experience that led to a vision of becoming a doctor. A graduate from Hope College, he reports that the late D. Ivan Dykstra, a highly regarded philosophy professor at Hope College, was his uncle. Russell Dykstra received his MD degree from Michigan State University's College of Human Medicine. Before retiring, he served as a family physician in Holland for 24 years. He brings to his HASS presentation this afternoon a passion for reading, experiences on land and sea in the U.S. Navy, and a knowledge of medicine and how severe hunger and thirst affect the human body. Dr. Dykstra, anchors away.
Anchors away, I see. I also see one of my MD teachers on the screen right now, Dr. Shield. Good to see you. I'm going to start with the outline, and some of you may have it, some of you may not, but that's fine. It reads as follows: a dialogue on details from Nathaniel Philbrick's In the Heart of the Sea. I want to specify dialogue. This is going to be a back and forth. This is not a lecture. What I bring is a sailor's take and a doctor's take on this book, built on a foundation of my career. In the introduction, I use the phrase nesting careers for this presenter, which means that one career forms the foundation of the next career, and so on. When I read a paragraph that reads like this: lucky number 7, draftee, a curious way of dodging a year of dodging bullets in Vietnam. The 1971 draft lottery, you had to have a number higher than 91 not to go to Vietnam. I had lucky number 7. And I had a creative Navy recruiter who talked me into signing up for 6 years in the nuclear Navy to get an education. I became a machinist mate. I served on the USS Kitty Hawk as an aircraft carrier. I became an engineering laboratory technician who is the body chemist for a nuclear propulsion system. I served on the USS Virginia out of Norfolk, Virginia. And April 18, 1977, I had what I call a benign barotraumatic epiphany after witnessing a cruise missile launch at sea that directly led me to a career as a medical doctor. Now, what we're talking about is not my story, it's Philbrick's story. If there's time, I can talk to you about that uncommon phrase, barotraumatic epiphany, or the word benign counts too. Now, in the approach, the architecture of this strategy comes from a nice essay titled Not Teaching the Whole Book that was in the teacher's guide for this program. I have listed the guide's essential chapters below, but all chapters are open for discussion. During a discussion of each highlighted chapter, I invite from the audience any ideas of a sailor's take and a doctor's take. The first chapter is essential. It is a central introduction to the island of Nantucket. And to me, it made a strong impression of simultaneous cultures, the culture of America in 1820, the unique culture of Nantucket Island in 1820, the culture of whalers, and the culture of whales. And I'm wondering if any participants have questions or comments about the things that come up in that first chapter.
Speak up if you have a question. I think we could try that. Unmute yourself and speak up if you have a question.
And if not, we can move on. Well, in that case, I will give my doctor's take and sailor's take about the island of Nantucket. The culture of Nantucket was unique. It was Quaker, and the structure was that the father, the whaler, was gone for 3 months, no, home for 3 months, gone for 3 years, home for 3 months, gone for 3 years. And in both the book and the movie, there are recurrences of this unit of time, 3 months. In the movie, Herman Melville interviews Mr. Nickerson, the only surviving member of the cast, or the crew, I should say, and offered to pay him 3 months boarding for one night of conversation. When Mr. Chase came back in the movie, he had a daughter he'd never seen who was 3 months old. So there's a recurring theme in that. I will move on to chapter number 3, whose title is First Blood. In there, the description said, not necessary, but provides a detailed account of how a whale was killed and harvested for blubber. Now, I watched the movie last night, and that goes into great detail on that. That's too gruesome for some people. And if you watch the movie, when you get to that part, close your eyes for 10 seconds, things will be okay. Any other thoughts or questions about this first chapter?
Well, I thought it certainly was gruesome, and I didn't want to read it, but I thought it was very necessary to understand what a whaling expedition would be and what they would go through.
Absolutely. And that's where the book and the movie known together gives the big picture. And it is a big picture. It is a huge picture. When they first found a whale on Nantucket, it had washed up on sand. And they learned what to do with it. And they learned it was good to get more. And they go out farther and farther, a couple miles out, 2 miles out, 4 miles out. But by the time of this book, they went from Nantucket all the way down the southern end of South America to the middle of the Pacific Ocean to find whales. That teaches a lot about how the whale culture developed over a few hundred years. There's a chapter 5 is titled The Attack, perhaps the most important chapter. Another strong chapter to combine the book and the movie because of the attack of the whale. And the movie does a very good job of coloring that whale. It was not a white whale. It was a black and white whale with a skin disease that I think may be similar to a human disease called vitiligo. Dr. Scheel, I'm sure you know that word. Spots of white and black. And that was the performance art for that whale in this movie. Is anybody curious about the nature of that attack, where they were and what they did?
I was wondering, when you said that, was that a very, very unusual whale then?
Very unusual.
Okay.
Unusual in some ways, but consistent with whale culture in another way. The whale culture paralleled Nantucket culture. The cow and the calf stayed together. The whale was on his own and doing whatever he wanted to do.
But
I mean the male whale.
The male whale, the father. You bet. That was a guy thing.
But apparently they weren't turned off by seeing this whale. They knew that kind of whale.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
they can't pick their whales. They pick what they do with the whale.
Right, right.
And the whales pick what they do with the boats. There is a very telling part in the story in the movie about what drew that particular whale. There was an act called coppering, where on the hull of a damaged whaleboat, Mr. Chase was pounding copper to cover a hole. But whales navigate by echolocation. That is, their brains sense sounds and the direction from which that sound comes. The writer believes that that pounding of coppering is what attracted that whale to that ship.
Huh.
And I'm curious if anybody's familiar with the term Tryworks, Tryworks.
Yes, that's the pot in which they boil the fat and sort of extract the oils.
Specifically, it is the brick stove built in the middle of a ship to burn, to melt the whale blubber into whale oil, because that was the cash crop. In both the book and the movie, they include a part of the movie after the whale has struck the ship, where the melted whale blubber and the ship caught on fire, and that spilled onto the water, and that caught on fire, which took me directly back to one curious day in boot camp, 1972, where they taught us what a sailor must do in a setting like that. When you're thrown in the water and the water above you is in flame, what do you do? Well, that's what they teach us in boot camp. We can come back to the attack chapter later, but I want to skip to the island, which is described as a chapter of lost hope. And there was no shortage of lost hope getting onto this island. And I wonder if people have any impressions or questions about the island and what was going on with those sailors at that point in the story.
I'd like to read what I think is a significant portion of that chapter. I'm going to read from the bottom of page 146 to about the middle of the page 147, because I think it's critical about the Nantucketers and the other crew members, the blacks that are on the crew.
Yeah.
The blacks were also, in all probability, in poorer health than the whites, even before they started sailing on the Essex. The life expectancy of black infant in 1900, the earliest date for which there are statistics, was only 33 years, more than 14 years less than that of a white infant. Now, 38 days after the whale attack, it was plain to all that the African Americans, although not as weak as Joy, the third mate, were faring more poorly than the rest of the crew. At the other extreme were the Nantucketers. Besides being better fed, they had additional source of strength. They were all from the same close-knit community. The younger Nantucketers had been friends since childhood, while the other officers, especially Captain Pollard, demonstrated a fatherly concern for the teenagers' welfare. Whether enduring the torments of thirst and hunger on the boats or foraging for food on Henderson, the Nantucketers provided one another with support and encouragement that they did not offer the others. They had all seen how the man-of-war hawks robbed the tropic birds of their food. As conditions deteriorated on the boats, one could only wonder who of these 9 Nantucketers, 6 African Americans, and 5 white islanders would become the hawks, and who would become the tropic birds. Chappell, Wright, and Weeks decided that they didn't want to find out. They're the 3 that stayed on the island. Right. Earlier, there was a mention about how the hawk bird would pursue the tropic birds, the littler birds. They were, the tropical birds were finding fish and partially eating the fish, and the hawks would pester them to such an extent that the tropic birds would throw up their food, and then the hawks would eat the food, and it would not go to the children or the baby chicks of the tropical birds. And I thought that was an interesting image that he brought up to use to describe, in effect, the kind of survival of the fittest mentality that we see developing perhaps in this story.
I have a comment, but I'll wait for others.
The health disparities between blacks and whites today are just as striking as they probably were then.
Yes. Any other thoughts? What we have just described is a biological version of a well-known structure in human culture, the caste system. In birds, there is a caste system. On board military ships, there is a caste system. It is illegal for officers to mingle with enlisted people except in giving them direction. I'm hearing some background sound.
Oh, yeah, I'm watching a class.
And now that sound is gone.
Thank you.
But the term caste has a resonance in present day, especially with the current book titled Caste by Isabel Wilkerson.
Which is now at the top of the bestseller list, the New York Times.
For a good reason.
Yeah.
And the military caste system does not follow the caste system of India or Nazi Germany. but military always has been a caste system in terms of chain of command and who can talk to whom.
How is that in effect also on the ship, the Essex? There's a structure of leaders and followers, I think,
That's
that
right.
is pretty
That's right.
interesting.
And the leader is the captain. The follower is the first mate who makes everybody else follow the captain's lead. And the captain's lead is what brought them into troubled waters. But the captain blamed the first mate for being there. The first mate had followed the captain's orders with which he did not agree.
Well, wasn't it that Pollard, the captain, after the sinking, wanted to sail in the direction of Tahiti?
Yes,
Would have been the better move,
yes,
but did not use his authority to override the opinion of Chase and Joy,
yeah.
who wanted to go toward South America.
There was a struggle of who was in charge.
And he did not, and had he used his total authority, there might have been a different outcome.
Do you know why Chase and Joy wanted to avoid Tahiti?
They thought there were cannibals there.
Bingo. Bingo. And that's very ironic as the story proceeds.
Yes.
Yes.
Other thoughts? The next highlighted chapter is Games of Chance, which it says is vital to understand the hardships the Essex crew endured. Once again, a moment where it is powerful to combine reading the book and watching the movie, and in my case, having been out at sea. I'm sure there's a very common term people know of as sea legs. I'm curious, what is a HASP member's take on the term sea legs?
I'm guessing it's the ability to walk on a ship that's pitching back and forth on lots of waves. And so you develop a way to keep your balance as you walk along.
You're constantly in motion, constantly in motion. And sometimes when I would be at sea for 6 weeks and we get on land, standing in line at a store or something, I couldn't help but rock back and forth. That's what my body was used to.
There's accompanying seasickness too, which is part of the whole sea legs issue. This is Tom Reddick.
That's
I think
right.
I'm unmuted.
And on the USS Virginia, there was a standard method for dealing with fresh sailors who wanted help for seasickness. I went to the sick bay and I said, what can you do to help me with seasickness? They gave me a plastic bag to keep in my back pocket because they said, if you throw up, you clean it up. I also found out where on a ship in high seas is the best place to be to avoid seasickness. As far down as you can go, immediately standing across the keel, right in the middle of the boat. And that's where my laboratory was, in the engine room, as an engineering laboratory technician. So I learned how to deal with seasickness, but they had no sympathy for that.
I'm curious.
Yeah, Lou, go ahead. Can you get closer to your mic?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
I hear you well.
Okay. Does every sailor get over seasickness?
Some more than others. And that comes from the nervous system. No two people are wired the same when it comes to how the brain works. And the essence of seasickness, the essence of sea legs, is a very important sense of the nervous system called proprioception, which is an uncommon word, but it basically, there's a part of our brain that is aware of the position of every joint in the body in real time, whether or not it is moving, and estimating where it will be in the next 1/10 of a second. That's what gives sailors sea legs, is learning that automatically.
Is it tied to vertigo and balance mechanisms too?
Absolutely, it's all part of the balance. And feeling right about movement or not right about movement, that all comes from that same part of the brain. It has to do with a sense of body position where some things just don't add up correctly. Like if you're on a roller coaster. That's new. That's strange.
Just to follow, I'm imagining, a sailor or Navy man or whatever, after months and months, let's say even, in excess of a year at sea.
Yes,
I'm imagining that you get, somehow your body learns to deal with this.
you get used to it. That's especially true for submarine sailors. Their nervous systems learn that environment. And for some submarine sailors, they are underwater for 3 consecutive months. Their nervous system has to be retrained when they get to land. There's a high incidence of auto accidents in people who come back after 3 months underwater. They haven't seen anything more than 60 feet away.
Wow.
It's an accommodation. But
Thank
that's how our nuclear Navy works. There's attack subs, and then there's the boomer subs. They're the ones that contain a bunch of missiles, and they just prowl silently under the water for 3 months at a time.
Can I ask one more question?
Please.
Sure.
I read about Rickover years and years ago, and I understood he interviewed every single person who served on a nuclear sub. Is that your case too?
Every single officer. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting did a wonderful biography of Rickover in 2014 that illustrates what his interview of a certain lieutenant named Jimmy Carter was like. And Rickover had his own performance art. He always sat at a desk with nothing else in the room except a single chair where the interviewee would sit. And he had chopped the front legs off by 1 inch that the interviewee would have to sit in. So they would always feel off balance while talking to him, while being terrified of talking to him. And he kept his men off balance, but that's what an admiral for a submarine and surface Navy have to do, is keep his troops off balance so they always adjust to being off balance. And I was glad that Jimmy Carter was a nuclear officer at exactly the same time I was a nuclear enlisted, early 70s.
Thank you.
Chapter 12. First of all, back to chapter 11. Understanding the hardships the Essex crew endured. Can anybody else think of other hardships?
Well, there was a lack of food.
A lack of food, indeed.
And in the age of Me Too, this is Tom again, I think we have to mention that there was often rape involved in the seated going voyages of cabin boys and such.
Huh. I hadn't thought about that, but that's part of the landscape.
And the
There was a
Irish
hint-
band, the Pogues, have an album titled Rum, Sodomy, and the Lash. One
Wow.
of the best albums from Ireland in years.
My goodness, that's harsh.
There-
But it's
there-
also,
There was a hint of that in here where it says that the lower crew, the mainly the blacks and a few non-Nantucketers, they had to be in a part of the boat that the captain and the first mate and second mate never really went to. And untold things sometimes happened there for good or ill to these kids, in effect.
and that part of the boat was named the forecastle,
Yes, I think so. That's it.
which is an abbreviated pronunciation of the word forecastle
Yes.
at the very front of the boat. The worst place to be when the shipping is rough.
And the people there didn't eat the same kind of food that the captain and first mate and second mate ate.
Correct.
And they complained about the food. And that was the only time that, to my knowledge, that we really saw the captain lose it, maybe deliberately to show anger, because he didn't want any kind of questioning of the conditions, because it would lead to perhaps mutiny.
That's
And
right.
so that's where he put his foot down big time. And after that, the people in the place that in the front of the boat, they just kind of swallowed their animosity at that point and just lived with what their conditions were.
Thank you. Any other thoughts about the games of chance?
I got a question about navigation.
Yes,
I understand they were able to determine their latitude
correct.
with an astrolabe or
Yeah,
kind of an instrument or a sextant.
yes.
How were they able to determine longitude?
That's a very interesting question that spawned a wonderful book by that title Longitude by Dava Sobel. He talks about the importance of having a working clock while navigating the ocean. You could not
You have to
measure,
have a clock. You have to have an
have to
accurate.
have a clock.
Yeah.
They didn't have clock.
In the movie shows that at one point they did. The book did not
Okay.
describe that.
Okay, they had a clock before the boat went down or
Well,
afterwards?
but they had a type of a clock, which was a rope with knots in it that would tow back behind the ship. And that was how they estimated the length they were doing by how much the water pulled the knots. And that's the source of the word knot in terms of nautical miles per hour. Are there any sailors in the group?
But I don't, it seems to me, I looked up longitude on Google.
Yeah.
And it was quite a bit later that longitude was developed. I mean, the determination of longitude was perfected, but it required very precise timepieces.
That's right. That's right.
I've never owned a boat, but I do sail with all my friends who own boats, so I don't have to have the responsibility for owning it or taking care of it.
Congratulations.
So that's the place to be, in my opinion.
Have you heard of a boat?
I can comment on that. This is Linda Walbert. I wrote a book for children on Edmund Halley.
Oh, yeah.
Of Halley's Comet. And the marine chronometer was invented in his day, during his lifetime. His life ended in 1658. So they had a clock that was balanced so that it would offset the wobbling of the ship. And of course,
Absolutely.
the tremendous
Absolutely.
problem of having a pendulum work. And
Right.
so created something that the pendulum would correctly work on a ship
Right.
that was bobbing back and forth to get the exact time, because then if they took the measurement in the sky with either the astrolabe or the what was the other, the sextant. Yeah. They had to know the exact time, and then they could
Yes.
look it up in a chart, this huge chart that would tell them
Yes.
exactly where they were from the time and the measurement.
And if you can't know the exact time, you can't know where you are.
Right.
It's true.
So
And for a while, they did not know where they were, but somehow they figured out they were over 1,000 miles away from the coast of South America with no sail.
Mhm. But what I didn't quite understand that was described in the book, they explained it, but dead reckoning, I didn't understand that, but that was apparently another way to guess your.
That's right. And that had to do with the knotted boards on a rope.
Okay,
That's part of dead reckoning, where there's no moving parts except a rope with knots in it.
but was that still basically a measurement of time? Like how many knots did you,
I think it was an estimate of speed,
of speed?
but then
Be
what is the knowledge of speed if you can't apply time?
Yes, it's
You
units
can't
per
figure out how much you've covered.
hour, like feet per second or miles per hour. That's
So in the early 19th century,
of distance of time.
in the early 19th century, as they were sailing from Nantucket all the way to beyond the Galapagos Islands, it was easy to get lost. That's a sobering thought. The chapter 12 it says, its title is In the Eagle's Shadow, and it was the moment of rescue. And I'm curious to hear impressions from somebody who has not seen the movie but read the book, and somebody who has seen the movie and read the book regarding that first rescue.
I have not seen the movie, but I have read the book, and I thought the narrative of it was probably the most exciting part of the whole movie. They didn't want to let that boat get away from them,
That's
and
right.
so they rowed and rowed and rowed as fast as they could. They tried to catch up with that boat.
Yeah.
And that part I think was a great read.
And that was the ultimate display of the human survival instinct.
Right. That's about
You-
page 184, 185, 186. That's some of the most powerful narrative I think in here.
Marvelous. And then now we can jump around, but I want to go from the rescue to the homecoming, which is very elegantly described in the book and also elegantly displayed in the movie in terms of the attitudes toward the survivors as they returned home. Can anybody share their impression of how that was described?
Well, it was a big cover up just got underway as soon as they got home, and they tried to hide so that they wouldn't disclose what had gone on.
Sure,
Which I'm a lawyer and I'm familiar with everybody covering things up, and
sure,
there's usually a break and somebody comes loose with it.
sure. We had that. I'm talking about in the first few minutes after people who had been on the Essex actually got off the ship that brought them home. The very first few minutes walking onto land from the dock.
I was surprised to see that their families had somehow gotten all the way to, where were they? Chile? They were greeted by families in the movie.
But when they were greeted by people on the dock, it was wordless. Nobody said anything. They didn't praise their return.
Right.
They were stunned and they wondered, how did they get through that? And that was one of the details to hide. The other detail to hide being what happened to the ship. And one of the strong points of the book and the movie is both Captain Pollard and Mr. Chase both knew they could not be purchased to lie about what happened to the ship, even though that would hurt business. They both told the truth at the end in the Inquisition.
Yeah, and I can also say, as an attorney, we had these cases in law school with ship, survivors eating each other, and necessity is not a defense to murder. You still are accused of murder when you kill somebody and eat them.
Sure.
You can't say, oh, I had to do it or I wouldn't have lived. So they were actually under a threat of a murder charge when they confessed to these.
Sure. And do people remember, either in the movie or the book, the drawing of lots to see who should die? That was part of the story.
Yeah, and actually in the
Games
leading
of
case,
Chance chapter.
there was a leading case where one of the guys didn't draw lots and he actually didn't get charged with murder. So if you don't agree to murder somebody and you just eat, but he ate the most of the victim. So eating is not the problem, it's the agreeing to kill. Drawing lots is
I think
agreement to murder.
The eating was a problem for every survivor, but they had to be survivors first. They did not want to tell the story.
Well, and for future reference, just don't draw lots and eat if you don't want to get charged with murder.
And in the movie, Mr. Nickerson, interviewed as an adult, revealed that when he told Herman Melville that story about the cannibalism, he had never told anybody about that before.
Not a surprise.
Whether that's true or not, it doesn't surprise me, but it's a good point in the movie.
One thing that kind of puzzled me was that issue, because when that whaler off the coast of South America found them and rescued, there's much comment in the book, at least, that they were eating human bones. They were gnawing on sucking marrow out of human bones, so that they must have known that they were eating the remains of the crew.
Yes, and here, go ahead.
Well, how is it that didn't get back to Nantucket?
That's a good question. Now, Dr. Shield, if you're still out there, I'd like your doctor's take on the eating of bones. And if you're not there, I'll give my take on that.
I have a friend whose mother lives on marrow. She eats it every day for breakfast. She's Chinese.
There's a reason for that, but people may not know what the bone marrow does. It's the factory for building all of our cells. And it's very elaborate complex of bone and spaces and living things that create more living things. It's a survival method for these guys. And they also cherish the bones of crewmates.
I got another question. As I recall, they only put one of the crew to death. one
As
agreed
opposed to
to.
the other ones dying spontaneously from dehydration and
Yeah,
malnutrition.
but only one of them agreed to sacrifice himself.
Yes.
I can't remember who it was.
Oh, it's on 176 in the book. I'd like to read the paragraph or so on that. They cut up a scrap of paper and placed the pieces in a hat. The lot fell to Owen Coffin. My lad, Pollard cried aloud. If you don't like your lot, I'll shoot the first man that touches you. Then the captain offered to take the lot himself. Who can doubt but that Pollard would have rather have met the death 1,000 times, Nickerson wrote. None that knew him would ever doubt, but Coffin had already resigned himself to his fate. I like it as well as any other, he said softly. Lots were drawn again to see who would shoot the boy. It fell to Coffin's friend, Charles Ramsdell. And then it goes on from there. And I think that Coffin is a real hero in this book for that kind of sense of self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
He was willing to it. And Pollard, would have wanted to take his place, but I see that particular set of paragraphs as the part of the book that really indicates heroism.
Now, here's a part that is not described in the book, as I can tell, but is in the movie. That when Charles Ramsdell was chosen to shoot the boy, he did not. He shot himself.
Oh, I didn't know that.
That's in the movie.
Well,
That's
I thought in the
dramatic.
movie, wasn't that the boy shot himself? That's what I thought happened.
A young man shot himself. I may be wrong on the name.
I think it was the boy who actually didn't have a lot drawn. The
maybe.
cousin of the captain in the
Okay.
movie. It was the cousin of the captain that shot himself.
Correct.
It was a little different than the book, because in the book he'd been drawing a lot and he didn't do that. It was the captain drew the lot,
Right.
and he said, "I'll take the bullet for you."
And that's where we get different perspectives from movies and books. But it's interesting. It's a good mind game to consider the two platforms, the book and the movie, different details and more imaginary details when we read, but visible details when we watch.
But as I remember, there was only one killing.
Correct. Numerous deaths, but only one killing.
Dracula died and Reedon, yeah.
And the first ones that died, they simply pitched their bodies overboard. And it was only when they really experienced the hunger that they
Yeah.
decided that they had other uses for bodies.
That's the survival instinct. That goes back a long way. Now, there are two linked final chapters, 13 and 14. In the teacher's guide, it said, homecoming describes what happens days and weeks after the rescue. Consequences is a depiction of how the crew survives in the years after the shipwreck. And I'd like to encourage some impressions or comments from people about those parts of what happened after the catastrophic trip.
I was struck by the fact that even though the sea was their livelihood, after experiencing what they did, that the several of them, including Pollard and Chase, did go back to sea,
Yes.
back into that same expanse and it didn't seem as if it was because that was the only thing they knew how to do. It seemed as if that was what their life was.
Well, that was Pollard's impression. He was born into that role. And he lost another ship off the coast of Hawaii.
And then at that point, I think he retired, didn't he?
I believe after that, yes.
Yeah.
I don't think he went out again after that.
No.
Enough is enough.
Well, I've sailed enough to see I could be easily hooked on it. If I had been in the Navy or anything, I'd want to go back.
One of my dreams in the Navy, my 18 months out at sea, was taking a cruise ship where I didn't get paid to be there. I would actually pay to be waited on. But now in the COVID-19 era, that's a game changer too. Cruise ships become incubation chambers, but then all ships are incubation chambers.
I heard they're letting the cruise ships operate again, and I don't know how they're going to do it. Slap masks on everybody and make everybody stand 6 feet apart on the deck.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, good luck with that. Is right.
But
Maybe
that's
only
about-
those that have had COVID-19 will sign up.
maybe so, or maybe not many people will sign up.
But do these antibodies persist? I'm not so sure. I think it's like
That, well, see, this is all uncharted territory. Here's my doctor's take on that. This is all uncharted. And I've heard reports about how antibodies can be detected after an infection, but a few months later, they are gone.
exactly.
And that complicates the vaccine approach. But once again, we're getting into the 21st century. This story is in the 19th century. And any other thought about the consequences, how people lived after that catastrophe?
Certainly had post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, that was
Absolutely.
keeping it a secret,
Absolutely.
which could affect your lives in lots of ways.
In the movie, there's a wonderful, right near the end of the movie, as Melville is interviewing Nickerson, as Melville was leaving, Nickerson stood by the door and he said, "Hey, I just heard about somebody in Pennsylvania. They drilled a hole and they're getting oil from the earth."
Yeah, that was great. So much for getting ambergris and everything.
And this whole tale is about fuel and money. And fuel and money is powerful. And we're still in the fuel cycle as we emerge past fossil fuels.
And most of our wars had some fossil fuel angle to them at every turn.
That's right.
Indeed.
But the Indians saw the whales as food. And then the whales became fuel. And then the money from whales was invested in textiles. The money from textiles was invested in oil wells.
Yeah, in my law practice, I did international environmental law, and the only people we could stop from eating the whales were the Japanese, and they'd insist, we get to eat them. Even
Yeah.
though they're endangered species, they get to kill a few.
They wanted to be an exception. But I think in the centuries contained in this book through the present day, we see lessons that we can learn in a society where there's never been more complex, useful global information passage than right now about the transition in fuels in our cultures. And what's the effect of certain fuels on the life of this planet? That's the only one we know.
Well, I've been to enough climate sessions at HAFS to know that the fossil fuel area is leaving a legacy. In addition to which, I wrote a book chapter on climate change liability, which is probably going to be like tobacco, and eventually all the oil companies are going to pay the piper.
That sounds reasonable to me. But money talks, and sometimes money buys good lawyers for a long time.
That was true in tobacco. It'll surely be true in climate.
Sure. It's true in opiates as well. But again, we're diverting from the story. I want to just read, we've got plenty of time still, but I want to read the bottom of my outline for some of you who don't see that, about a 2020 hindsight from myriad book journeys I've taken with the Lakeshore Big Read. I've been involved in 7 of 7 years with this. This ex-nuke, not only did I dodge a year of dodging bullets in Vietnam, I dodged a year of making other people in Vietnam dodge my bullets. While at the same time, I was living, learning, and teaching inside of a nuclear weapon. And I'm curious, does some of the people here have a military background? Any veterans in the organization here?
Not getting any response.
Not me.
I
I've just
hear,
called wars.
I hear a silence there. But I grew up in high school where every boy had the draft hanging over his head. I was in 10th grade in 1968 at the Tet Offensive. and weapons run deep. And sometimes the realizing of what weapons do create conscientious objectors.
You apparently had a mystic experience after the seeing a weapon being exploded. Once you're in it, you can't very well get out easily. How did you deal with that?
Well, let me describe the experience. I'm glad we have time to do that. My work on the USS Virginia was I was working on a newly built warship that was practicing all of its weapons. Well, my place was in a laboratory, air conditioned, down in the engine room. But one night they invited me to come up and watch a missile launch. The cruise missiles were new at that point. Unfortunately, somebody had put up on the bulletin board in our bunk room a picture of what a cruise missile does to another ship. And that stays in my memory. But I watched this missile launch from a distance of about 50 meters. And it was like taking every 4th of July I'd ever heard, seen, or felt in my entire life and compressing it into 4 seconds. The sounds I heard, I did not hear through my ears. I heard through the bones in my face, the jelly inside my eyes, the air in my lungs. I was jaw dropped for a moment, and then the gears started turning inside me, thinking, all right, that's what it was like here. What's it like on the other end? That led to a night of fitful sleep with prophetic dreams. And in the morning, I woke up. I knew I was going to become a conscientious objector so I could get off that ship and use the tools the Navy had armed me with, applied not to nuclear destruction, but human medicine instead. It took me 14 months to convince the Navy that I was sane and that I was honest, but it did work. But being a conscientious objector for 14 months on a warship, doing war games, I figured my best approach to this is a low profile and not being a vociferous protester, just kind of quietly working on what I was working on. And the Navy used that against me, that I was not obvious enough as a conscientious objector on a warship. But there's a Quaker group, and we haven't talked about Quakers yet, but the Quaker
They're
connection.
prominent in Nantucket.
That's huge. And the Quakers had started an organization in Philadelphia, the Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors, and they guided me how to do that, including connected me with a good lawyer. What I hadn't known was that there was an automatic thumbs down from the captain of my ship. He did not believe in conscientious objectors. But my lawyer immediately took that over his head to the Department of the Navy, and they granted my request after 14 months. At the time, the ship's number 2, the executive officer, brought me that telegram. I was standing up on a weather deck on a very quiet, calm day, and I read this, realizing that I was going to get out honorably so I could get the GI Bill. And all of a sudden I had another mystical experience that was like, I suddenly imagined myself as on the wing of an eagle soaring on the updrafts from the Grand Canyon. And one feather falls off and silently circles downward. And that feather was me leaving the Navy in that instant. There were 5 days before we got back from out at sea. Time to think about things. Then it was time to go and come to Hope College. And I didn't think of it as a mystical experience, but in the last few years, I've been part of a group started by Chris Kaiser and Peter Gonthier. You may know some of them. In 1985, on a discussion group that touches on religion and science and the boundaries or lack of boundaries between them. And this all ties together quite well for me.
Thank you for that story. Life-changing.
It is. Now here's something that I included it's not included in the outline you are using. But I wrote in that about being a conscious objector in an MD. And this year I discovered a direct link to Albert Einstein. Everything in the Navy that's nuclear, was run under the Atomic Energy Commission. The Atomic Energy Commission was formed in 1947 with a professional committee. And that committee was led by Albert Einstein. So that's a sense of connection for me through a dangerous space that led me to a safer space where I wasn't blowing things up, but I was listening to people instead. But complicated systems that operate 24/7 in a high-risk environment, that's a nuclear ship engine room, that's a human body. And the one prepared me for the other so well. It was like fitting into a already well-worn leather glove that fits. And being a machinist mate in the Navy was not my choice. I wanted to be an electronics engineer technician. But as a machinist mate, I had to learn all the piping, all the valves, all the things that control all the piping, the valves and the pumps, what everything was made of, what it all looked like in cross section, and what happens when things get old, or things get loose, or things are not right. Complicated systems, 24/7, high risk. That's a preparation for medicine, among other things.
Are there any questions that anybody has about the book itself? Any particular portion that was confusing to you, or perhaps you have a favorite portion of the book that you want to share by reading it to us?
Judy, it's Lou again.
Yes.
My question, and what I'm really curious about, is this book was published in 2000,
Correct.
and all of a sudden it seems like it's everywhere. It's actually the book club book for the Saugatuck Douglas Library next month. And then I just heard that someone's child had it in class.
That's a direct result of the Big Read. Are you familiar with the Big Read?
Oh, no.
The Lakeshore the Big Read was started in 2014. And each year we've studied an important book and tried to get the whole community to read about it. The name has evolved to, it's now called the Lakeshore Big Read, which involves cities as far north as Grand Haven and Muskegon, and as far south as South Haven. It covers a lot of ground.
Gotcha.
And each time the selection made for Big Read, I think, meets several criteria. And I think it has to do with broadening the worlds of people who are reading it. It will
Yes.
It won't just be white people in the United States. It will be perhaps other cultures, or focus on other races. I remember the very first book that we read was To Kill a Mockingbird, which was an exposure to racism in the South.
Yes.
And the experience of how people handle otherness and difference. And I think the books are selected with that in mind. Do you think that this selection, well, I think for today, the fact that the story happened 200 years ago. And so I think that there's a connection there with the 200th anniversary that would tie this in, particularly to this year. Are there any comments that you have that you find that this book right now somehow fits the time that we're in? I'll start by mentioning that I was attuned to this book. I especially wanted to read it because it got me out of my world. I mean, reading about people experiencing difficulty in the South Pacific, I didn't have to deal with Washington, D.C. or our nation. And so that was a good thing. And I realized that, yeah, and then we were isolated in our homes to some extent. And that's not as bad as being isolated on a ship where you're forced to eat, or on a small boat and you're forced to eat your colleagues. And so it sort of helped me by a negative example to appreciate where I was. But I want to just read one comment. This is out of a New York Times story. It's titled How the Surging Virus is Crushed into Campaigning in Every Imaginable Way. This is October 29 in the New York Times. A quotation from Sandy Robertson, the Republican mayor of Rocky Mount, North Carolina, said, quote, "The whole COVID-19 experience has left a lot of people feeling a lot less in control, like you're just bobbing out at sea. There's a sense of helplessness. And that loss of control is having an impact, and we're going to see that politically. End quote.
Yeah, I mean, COVID is sort of like the whale that crashed the ship.
That is, it leads us into uncharted territory,
Yes.
as were the Nantucketers led into uncharted territory.
Yeah.
Here's a quote from chapter 6. Today, the Nantucketers' lack of knowledge of the Pacific in an ocean in which they had been sailing for several decades seems incredible. They weren't prepared for being lost in the middle of the Pacific, but they were there for work, for money, to make the owners of the ship wealthy. And yet held with dignity because you are a Quaker in Nantucket.
Your comments earlier on made me think of the whale being like climate change, right?
Yes.
Source of
Yes.
energy comes back to bite us.
Yes,
And in a certain sense, in climate change, we are cannibalizing ourselves, right?
That's right.
Sure.
but we're also given a wealth of information technology to figure out what is the right thing to do.
And strangely, we're ignoring it.
Well, some are ignoring it.
Well, and one thing I thought was really interesting is I'm a biodiversity lawyer, and I've always been fascinated by animal intelligence. We assume they're all
Yes.
stupid, right?
Yes,
But elephants and whales are big mammals with big brains who have
Yes.
all kinds of social things going on that we just don't understand. And whale language probably has a huge vocabulary we have yet to understand, right? I mean,
And
maybe
it's-
be talking to each other with their.
and it is founded in echolocation.
And it actually can travel. If you ever heard a coyote howl, they have a special howl to be found when they're lost that is designed to get through the wavelength is perfect to go for miles.
Sure.
And whales have certain calls that are designed to go almost all the way across the damn ocean. It's like,
That's right. And one thing I was not going to bring up, but since you did, a parallel between the culture of whales and the culture of elephants. Again, the calf stays with the cow. The fathers, the males, run wild. But
They have
they echo-
matriarchal organizations too, a lot of matriarchal pods in the killer whale world.
Now, would we consider the culture of Nantucket Island patriarchal or matriarchal? When there's a pattern where the sailor is home for 3 months, gone for 3 years, home for 3 months, gone for 3 years, who runs that show?
Well, while the men are gone, the women are running it.
That's right. There's a feature in the book I haven't touched on, but I will, about how popular opium became among the women on Nantucket. Did anybody catch that from the book? It's not touched on in the movie. But
I
when you
noticed it in the book.
Yeah. And when you travel that much ground, you find opium and you bring it back. And that was a balm of some sort for the women who missed their husbands, who didn't like running everything by themselves, but that's what they did. And the thing I've learned as a doctor about opiates is it's a product that always tastes like more. You like how it feels, and you know that more will get you there. But that's an interesting context in terms of the context of our current opioid epidemic. And the fact that the appearance of opium in China did not originate in China. It was brought to China by the British and by the Americans competing. The British brought it from India. The Americans brought it from Turkey. The Chinese took over. And it's ironic that in the present day, some people may know of a medicine called fentanyl. It's 80 times more powerful than morphine. And now there's an even stronger form called carfentanil that's used to sedate elephants. But that in large part is being manufactured in China illegally and sent over here.
Well, it kills you when it's in a dose. I lost a good friend to that.
Yes, yes. And it's a curious way to live. You feel very good about things. You go to sleep, but you just forget to breathe. That's a sobering thought, but there are sobering thoughts throughout this book. since we're kind of bouncing around, I'm glad that we are. I want to mention another book that I encourage people to read because the author will be part of the presenting authors for HASP this year. Skip Finley wrote a book, Whaling Captains of Color, with a subtitle, America's First Meritocracy. And on a whale boat, it is a meritocracy. It doesn't matter what color you are, it's do you have the skill to help yourself and everybody else survive in an incredibly dangerous situation with a whale. I'm sure people have heard, maybe not, the term Nantucket sleigh ride. Is that familiar to anybody?
Yeah, I've heard that. We used to do that to each other and almost like hazing.
Well, it's a form of hazing by a whale with a boat with harpooners on board, and the boat and the whale are connected by a harpoon. But there's a very specific point on the boat itself that right at the tip of the bow where the rope would go and would be held in place by a whale pin. And that became the mark of honor for a whaler to have a whale pin. That you'd been through that Nantucket sleigh ride. And in the closing of the movie, the young Mr. Nickerson, when Chase was still living, awarded him with a whale pin in recognition of his service. And the whale pin was big for impressing potential wives.
Okay.
When I first started reading the book, I was curious why it had been chosen because, as Judy, I think, mentioned, the previous books have all focused on another country or issues of race in between. And then suddenly I discovered In the Heart of the Sea, the whole issue with African Americans and how they were treated on the ship and back in Nantucket. But their savior was an African American man who developed the navigation
That's right.
device to help them.
And one thing in the book, it mentions that for spiritual guidance and prayerfulness, the sailors would turn to the Black members to lead that.
Hmm.
They may have been of the Pentecostal variety.
Hmm.
Here's a quote from page 132. White sailors often look to blacks and their evangelical style of worship as sources of religious strength. I'm also going to read a quote I have about the island from chapter 9. That was Ducie Island where they first landed. They landed on an island, but they couldn't find water. Eventually they did, but only under very exacting conditions of the tides. And underfed, having no shoes, they discovered that the island was a scrap heap of fractured coral as sharp and piercing as shattered glass. That's a vivid description of a harsh island that nonetheless seems like a place where you might get saved.
Yeah, I've cut my feet on coral beaches before because I was not wise about wearing shoes.
You know what he's talking about.
Yep.
But
Don't do it
there were
twice.
there were three that decided that they were not going to continue. They would prefer to be on that island,
Right.
where they might be able to eat some bird or maybe some turtles. And the main critical part, though, was fresh water. And they thought that
Yes.
maybe they would be lucky and get fresh water. And they did survive. I think
They did
told
survive.
they told the people that were leaving them behind, tell people that's we're here and come back to get them. And I think Pollard promised that he would do that.
Chase promised.
Okay, Chase promised.
And Chase, at the end of the movie, that is exactly what Chase did. He sent a boat to Ducie Island and saved all but one of them who had stayed there.
From an ecological point of view, it was very interesting how quickly they ran out of the food sources on that island.
That's right.
You know, the birds were suddenly gone, and if they had been there much longer, it wasn't just the fresh water. They had depleted all the bird population to such a degree that they wouldn't have had much left either.
They depleted, they had to eat birds' eggs.
Mhm.
And birds don't like that, so they go somewhere else.
That makes sense.
It's easy for them to see somewhere else, way up there. When you're flat on the surface, you can't see so much.
Well, they depleted the whales and they depleted the soil on Nantucket and
That's right.
there. So there's a lot of them, actually quite a bit. I missed when Don Triesenberg spoke. I've been in and out of the room here with a contractor. Sorry. But anyway, a lot of depletion, a lot of environmental degradation.
That's a story for today to pay attention.
So it's a
Because-
critical book, not only for matters of race, but also for sustaining our own environment.
Stewardship of this planet.
Stewardship, good word.
Yeah, on
And
the
we-
cannibalism issues, I found it interesting in the Pacifics, the Polynesians did practice cannibalism. I often wonder if it started on those long raft rides between islands, you know, that maybe they had to make some tough decisions to get to their destination.
And that mention of politicians links in another survival technique. Genetically, the Polynesians got fat easily.
Yeah, the
So when you're-
mitochondria, I actually met the guy when I was in the islands. They were studying the mitochondria and they
Yeah.
process energy quicker. They
Yes.
they actually, if you get a can of they love tinned beef and they blow up like a balloon when they eat it.
And mitochondria, those are the power plants of every living cell in our bodies.
So that was a survival distinction that helped them to survive other.
Because they were obese.
Okay,
It's not so handy in
because-
a modern culture though. Then they eat fast food, it's a disaster.
But our bodies are very good at storing fuel, and it recognizes fat as fuel. So our bodies are very gifted at storing the fuel, but we're not so gifted at deciding when we're storing too much.
okay.
I'm currently involved in a volunteer job that I'm doing with a man who's been schizophrenic for 40 years, has lived out of a car for 6, and is now in the latter house. And he is on the spectrum of what the men in these boats were in terms of what happens when your body has used all your fuel as fat, but you still need more fuel for your brain. The brain is always hungry for fuel. And once the fat's gone, it starts to use muscle. It converts muscle into fuel, but it makes you weak and it makes your body fall apart. And the solution is to eat the right things. But this man's schizophrenia includes an uncommon word, good Scrabble word, abulia, which basically means his chooser is broken. He knows there's something wrong, but he does not choose what to do about what's wrong, even though he knows what to do. And Don Shield knows this as I do, because that program that taught both of us taught us that with family medicine, a quarter of what a family doc does has a foundation in psychiatry. Would you agree, Don? You may have taught me that.
Well, the placebo effect is psychological and it's a huge effect on your body that they have to adjust for in studies. So
It's a mind game. It's a mind game. And there's a matter of research that's well done. But when you only study white men, that is not well done. You must include women. You must include the non-white. We'll
there's
always
also
be here.
there's a good study about paired couples and how they often die within a year of each other. It's
Sure.
partly from the depression from losing your lifelong mate.
That's right. But that's also part of survival. Having a mate, having a compatible, copacetic colleague to live with lengthens life, as opposed to living alone.
Yes, I hope that applies to people since I'm a caregiver for an 88-year-old. I hope that applies even if you're not married to the man.
One note I made about chapter 10, whose title is The Whisper of Necessity. In 1945, the University of Minnesota did an experiment on voluntary starving among conscientious objectors. I'm gonna turn to page 191 in the book here, what we
Okay.
commented about that. Because that taught them what happens when you are starving. And conscientious objectors knew that being studied for starving was still something better to do than making other people dodge your bullets. Don, I see you nodding your head. Cool.
Right. In the middle of 191, there's a sentence that said that as the participants in the Minnesota starvation experiment discovered in 1945, the recovery period was torturous part of the ordeal. It was as bad as the starvation part, the recovering part was bad too. Can you
Sure.
explain why that might be?
Well, there you go with my doctor's take and blending the movie and the book. In the movie, they did a very good job of depicting what a nutritional depleted man looks like and can and can't do. When Dickerson saw that a rescue ship was available, he tried to make Mr. Chase wake up, and Mr. Chase was just slumped over. He could not function. But being a conscious objector and being studied like this was still a better way than dodging bullets. They were helping people.
Well, I understand that like with the Auschwitz survivors, they had to be real careful and be medically supervised as they regained their function because they could kill themselves eating and drinking a feast right away.
Sure, sure. And that ties in with a current book by Isabel Wilkerson, Caste, as she compared the caste system in India, the Black experience in this country, and the Jewish experience in World War II Germany. Intensity, a lot of starvation.
I think I read a review of that. That's a pretty new book, isn't it?
It's new this year.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to read that.
And I wanted to read that in part because I knew I had been part of a caste system as an enlisted man in the military. But there's a spectrum in types of caste systems and a spectrum in how long such systems have been around. I'm sure military has been a caste system ever since there's been military. That precedes writing. I don't know how far back Hindu history goes, but it's thousands of years. Caste system. How does one change a caste system? And that ties in with Fred Johnson's wonderful talk from Monday night about the origins of the American caste system.
Some of that is going to change inevitably in our country because we will have more minority groups let's say outpopulating the white people. And so the white supremacy is something that people are hanging on to with claws almost, because
Sure.
they see that the population growth of people of color,
Yes.
and especially if we have more fair immigration policies, then things will change by demographics, birth.
And then the whites will be the minority.
Right. And we need to treat people as if we're all the minorities in a way, give them extra privilege. I'm looking for a time when we can be more equitable in how we treat others.
And that takes me back to the crew of a ship and the meritocracy of sailors on a ship. Yes, your skins are a different color, but the job that everybody needs you to do correctly has to do with your skill, not your color. And also your ability to be a team player, because that's how crews on ships work. Now, I'm going to, I know we're getting, well, we got a few minutes yet, but I'm going to I want to close with something from late in the book. On November 16, 1869, Nantucket's last whaling vessel, the Oak, left the harbor, never to return. But there are consequences to that. and we're still learning. And the Japanese love their whales.
Yes, indeed.
Now here we're gonna, since we're almost at the end here, I can go on a bit of a tangent here. Has anybody seen, anybody who has seen the movie Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home?
I'm a Trekkie. I've seen it.
Okay, you know what I'm talking about. That they rescue whales from the Cetacean Institute in Sausalito, California, to save the planet. And that ties in. Not only that, I was stationed in that area during my time in the Navy on the USS Kitty Hawk, an aircraft carrier that was in dry dock, this biggest ship possible I've ever seen, completely out of the water. Unknowingly, when I walked on board, I did not know that that ship had been torn apart by race riots 6 months earlier. They had been 9 months off the coast of Vietnam, bombing the hell of everything, out of everything. And they were rationing food, and one black sailor grabbed an extra sandwich and then was treated roughly. That created a whole riot on that ship. When they sailed back under the Golden Gate Bridge, a large part of the crew was in the brig. And I got there 6 months later to this huge ship with everything torn apart on the inside. But I noticed that some sailors were walking around with handmade weapons. And I felt like I'd gone to prison. The book, Skip Findley's book, talks about on ships, the black sailors were always given the worst jobs. But on the USS Kitty Hawk, I had what I would call a warm body job, where warm body is the only qualification you need. It's between schools. But you could picture an aircraft carrier. Now picture another aircraft carrier within that, that's about 3 feet smaller or narrower or shorter. Those create all the fuel tanks that surround the entire ship. Jet fuel on the sides, diesel fuel on the bottoms. And my job for 3 months was as a tank cleaner on the Kitty Hawk. And I was working in tanks where they would pump them down as quickly as they could, as deeply as they could, but there's 3 or 4 inches of oil sludge on the bottom. And my job was to crawl under the ship, under those tanks under the ship with the diesel sludge, scrape it up with a scraper into a bucket and pump it out of that. In a tank that was no higher than 3 feet. I was on my hands and knees in oil sludge for 3 months. That might have been a black person's job, and I was a black person coming out of that hole. As a matter of fact, they wouldn't let us eat on the mess decks. That sounds like a caste system. They had to toss cold cuts down to us so we didn't mess up the mess decks.
Wow.
And for 6 months after getting off that ship and just going into classroom studies in the nuclear Navy, I would stain my sheets brown for 6 months as that oil was coming out of my body.
Wow, that's pretty incredible.
but no dull days in the Navy. I take that back. There are dull days in the Navy when you're out at sea doing the same thing every day and also eating exactly the same food every day for 2 weeks, when that's all you have left. And I remember the joy of getting closer to shore. You could smell the trees long before you could see the trees. And birds are a clue, as they are in the movie. When they were out at sea, they had no idea how close they were. When they finally saw birds in the air, they knew they were not far from land. And they were not far from land. So tying all this together as a sailor and a doctor, there's a lot of steps in associations within my learning brain that's been wonderful to do with this book.
And we thank you for doing that for us.
Yes, that was very good stuff.
So,
Right.
and I like the support from Judy and from Kim Mendels, especially with the unique year that HASP is functioning all online.
I have a question that come from one of the people in the group here.
Sure.
What was the reference to Fred Johnson on Monday night? Can you briefly say what it was that Fred contributed to the Big Read?
The role of race, the source of race, the study of race, the evolution of race, and Dr. Johnson's skill as a speaker. My involvement with Dr. Johnson is the reason I'm in the big read, because he was giving a question and answer after talking about in To Kill a Mockingbird. And I was in a group of 100 people, and I stood up for a question and answer. And Fred and I quickly figured out we were in the military at exactly the same time in the 1970s. I was in the Navy, he was in the Marines. I had a very good impression of the Chief of Naval Operations, Elmo Zumwalt, his efforts to improve race relations. Dr. Johnson's experience was exactly the opposite of that. But his talk Monday night, I thought it was a grand slam home run. And I wrote to the leader of the big read, Deb Van Dynen, about the images I had from that mental view of a grand slam home run. I saw the baseball carving a meteor streak across my sky as he hit the ball out of the park, out of the city, out of the state, out of the planet, briefly in orbit until it landed on the front deck, the planks of the Essex north of Henderson Island. And here's a term that people may not know. A term, plank owner, refers to someone who was the first crew on a ship when it is christened, is a plank owner.
There are additional Big Read events. I would mention that tonight at 6, Hope College English professor Kathy Verdine is going to be presenting an hour-long discussion of the relationship of the Essex to Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And I understand that I believe next Monday, the author of the book will be participating in a Zoom. I don't think he's here in person, but he will be available either virtually or in person to present some information also about the Heart of the Sea. So I would urge you to do a Google search on Hope College Big Read in the Heart of the Sea, and you will find more information about various events. There are more than 50 that are associated with this year. So I encourage you to keep learning, and I appreciate your attention and your contributions to the discussion today.
Just as
Thank
a
you very
coda,
much.
as a coda to your last comments, Judy, people, please look up when Skip Finley will be talking to us about his book, Whaling Captains of Color. It's part of this program this year.
Thank you.
Judy, do you know whether Dr. Johnson's talk from last night is available on YouTube?
I think it will be, but I'm not positive. Check with the Big Read, the website, and also you might want to even send an email message to Deb Van Dynen, who is the
Director.
chairperson of this whole thing.
Right.
She would know.
She
Okay.
got Fred Johnson involved from day one of this whole 7-year progress.
I'm embarrassed to say I saw a few minutes of his talk online. I can't remember how I accessed it, but I believe it was in an email that we received before his talk. A routine email from HASP, I think.
Cool. And that talk is so good, it's worth recording, burning it onto a CD and seeing it more than once. I plan to see it more than once.
I think it was a HASP email that had the link, but I wouldn't refer to it.
Wonderful. We are so well served by how we can communicate in the 21st century.
Well, thank you, Russell, for a very, very interesting presentation.
Appreciate that, Dr. Weller.
Yeah, I appreciated
Adriana
it
would have
too.
felt that too.
Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, great perspective from a Navy man on the sea, and complete with homesickness, seasickness, and a doctor's perspective. I think you combined it very well, plus the love for reading. Thank you so
right.
much.
Thank
Appreciate being
you.
invited.
Have a great afternoon, everyone. If you haven't
Thank
gotten
you.
outside to take a walk yet, go.
Yeah, sunshine.
Get out before they declare a state of emergency like Osceola.
Right. I miss you all. Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kim.
Bye.